All right, this is my remote. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all here. I hope everyone's had their coffee and is like properly awake for some shenanigans here on stage. So before I start, I would like a quick show of hands who knows what GA is, Google Analytics. Who's heard of it? Okay, we've got a few people. Who actually has worked with GA4? That is a sad few people, but we're going to try to make this happen. Okay, so we're here to talk about our journey to Google Analytics 4, specifically at Adore Me, and mainly about the challenges that we face making this migration, and as well as our custom Adore Me brand solution. So, before we start, let's begin with a little tech context. So, Google Analytics, for those of you that maybe are not as familiar, maybe you've heard it in passing, it is a web analytics service provided by Google, of course, that provides website traffic reporting as well as mobile traffic and events. It has its own platform that can both be used for configuration, like setting up all of the tracking and analytics, and it can also be used to do focus on data. We're not just going to rely on metrics, right? We're here to talk about the hard data. So, come on, you can do it, you can do it. It also has a lot of cloud integration. Specifically, the one that we're interested today is Google Cloud, which is a set of technologies that we work intensely with at Adore Me, and that allowed us to do all of the changes that I'm going to showcase today. All right, so the reason why we're all here is that Universal Analytics will be sunsetting in favor of Google Analytics 4. So, Universal Analytics has been around for more than a decade, but it started off as web-based traffic, and it was mainly rooted in quick observability via cookies for sessions. And unfortunately, with the passing of time, and particularly this current context where the focus lies more on cross-platform tracking and increasing concerns in user data security, that has slowly become obsolete. So in 2020, Google Analytics 4 was unveiled and announced as the replacement for Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, or as popularly known, GA360. So the initial timeline for the migration was set for July 1st, 2023, and that was eventually granted an extension until July 2024. Now, in this present moment, that puts us in a pretty critical moment as far as the migration timing is concerned, because 6 months may seem like a lot of time, but it is not. Anyone who has tried to do a migration knows that it's not that much time. So, why is this important for Adore Me in particular? Why does it have such a great impact on us? Well, as I mentioned, we have a very data-centric approach. So everything that we do is powered intensely by data. Nobody can breathe without having a chart or a number in front of them. It's the basis for most of our decisions. We want to understand the customer, so being company that sells items to the customer, we're interested in what the customer wants, and we try to get them specifically what they want from our website. So we do a lot of A/B testing. Our UX teams are constantly running tests on promotions, on layout, on lists, all kinds of stuff. There are at least a dozen active tests on the website at any given moment. And this enables us to have a fast reaction time to mostly everything that happens on our website, whether that's a slow promotion or something on the site that isn't working, maybe the user isn't seeing what they're supposed to be seeing. That gives us a lot of room to move around. However, this upcoming change with Google 360 and GA4 came with a lot of challenges, specifically with the data. And we had structure problems, there were concerns about how the data gets updated, and as well as cost, because unfortunately, analyzing this amount of data with a real-time demand solution can get quite pricey, so we're always interested in cutting the costs. But before we dive into that, I'm going to showcase a little bit the data, just so we know what we're dealing with. I can see a lot better on this one than I can see on this one. All right, so before we had, in GA360, we had session-based data, which meant that every single data point, every hit, every click, every single attribute was like nested under a user session. So one line was a user session, and then everything was nested under that. Now, with GA4, we have event-based data, which kind of changes a little bit the paradigm on which we're working, in that every single action on the website becomes an event. Now, this is not inherently bad, but we can all agree that it's a completely different transformation approach that is needed. The table structure was mostly the same. So where before we used to have sessions, now we have event tables, and they are split between permanent tables and intraday tables, which is data that is still being processed, is still being touched, is still getting added to. Now, all of the data is sharded by day, which is not the most friendly format, because the way to query sharded tables is mostly to use table suffixes, which unfortunately is not a particular cost influence, but it doesn't exactly help us either. So it's like a neutral standpoint, but it's also very slow, because before any data processing and lookup has to happen, the engine first has to find the tables that we're interested in looking at. So with the data structure and frequency, we had a few challenges. Mainly, the biggest problem that we had was the knowledge gap, because we didn't just switch from GA360 to GA4, we switched the technical team that was in charge of this completely. So from the UX team, which had mainly analysts, this came over onto the BI team. So we're a bit more techie, a lot more data structure oriented, I would say, but also we were missing a lot of the context. We did not know the data, we were not very familiar with the structure, with the process, like everything was a bit fuzzy. Then there was the shift that I talked about from session-based granularity to event-based granularity, because even though everything has become an event, which might make it easier, we still wanted to know like the delimiters, like when does a session start, when does it end, and what the user does during that session, because behavioral-wise, that's very important for us to know. Then we had day-partitioned data, and the way that we manage the sharded data, putting it into actual partitions, was a little bit of a challenge, considering that the data was moving around between the intraday tables and the permanent tables. That was a bit difficult to move through. The table structure would also suffer changes, since in the past few months since we've started this project, we already had a few breaking changes where randomly a record has appeared, and the record is on one platform, it's not on the other platforms. What do we do? How do we split the data? And finally, like a completely different sort of challenge, that now the event-based data didn't need unnesting, but it needed pivoting. So that's an entirely new thing that I do not want to teach to our end users. So we'll get to how we sorted that one out. The data had certain challenges in terms of how it was updated. First of all, there were a few hours in between when the data gets generated on the website to when it reaches us. And then it has to go through all of this processing and eventually end up with the business users, ideally as quickly as possible, which is, yeah, that's where the big challenge is in. And even the permanent data sometimes gets touched. Like there are certain updates that happen. We have variable time differences between the permanent data and the intraday data, which made it a little bit difficult. You can have one intraday table, you can have two, you can have 0, or you can have 3. We don't know. It changes day by day, and there's not like a set time where we can say, okay, at this hour, then the action happens. And aggregates had to be kept up to date. If we were going to parse all of this data, the big question was, how far back do we need to update, and how do we make a smart decision about how far back we need to update? Costs, my favorite subject. If you've been here last year, you know that I had like a whole presentation on costs, because fortunately, unfortunately, we're running on BigQuery, which is an on-demand data service. So the more we use, the more we get charged. And if we're not smart about our use of data, then we get a call from finance at the end of the month. It's like, what did you do here? So ideally, we would all like to avoid that call. We want to avoid having that call from the CFO. So there are a few challenges there too, because we process a lot of data daily. So 10, 15 gigabytes of data per day may not seem a lot, but then it piles up. So when you're looking for data from back in 2017, and you add up all of that, well, it's not nice. You get to see like the terabytes racking up. Then we had a lot of teams that do multiple analyses, so it's not just one query to get the data. There's like constant dashboards, and particularly with the A/B testing, that tends to get a little bit out of control when it comes to people looking at the session data. And it was hard to keep track of the data after it left our source, so that made it even harder to manage like an actual real-time cost management solution. So the tech, of course, wasn't that optimal either. We had a few challenges. They're not the worst of them, mainly like wishful thinking, but stuff that we really wanted to have. So the parsing data was a big challenge in particular here, because we had to first masticate it, then get it into a proper format to serve to the business. And while we were at it, we wanted to create like a flexible data flow where it wouldn't just like fall down at the nearest breeze of wind when like one variable would change from a 0 to a 1. So it had to take into account all of those changes. For the parsing of data, a lot of transformation was mainly needed because raw data is not something that you want to put in the hands of your analysts. We did that. They can work with it, but it's not ideal. We wanted a smarter solution than that. We also had to backfit the data into a suitable format because we already had like an established analytics pipeline where people knew what they wanted to look at, and it was our job to provide that data. Duplication risks when you're dealing with this sort of transformation, that is always something that might be on the list, and especially with the new system where we had a lot of events, there was always the risk that we could duplicate something. Some events show up more than once, then the flag isn't right, and then you get a call from UX, it's like, this one isn't working, fix it. So yeah, life in the day of a BI engineer. We had some issues with the getting of data to the business, and specifically making it in a format that they would be able to easily work with. So the old pipeline had to be thrown away, right? Because this is like a completely different technology. The events were working different, the sessions were working different. Some of it had to be like completely removed. We couldn't use most of the infrastructure that was before because it didn't make sense on the current technology. We also wanted to have ease of access as a standard because, especially in the BI team, we want to be able to offer our users like the least time that they can have to sort and transform the data, and more time towards actually looking at it and making decisions. there also had to be data comparison in between the two of them because, well, if you've touched on the business at least once, you know that you can't just like go from one source of truth to the other. It's like, oh, we're using this now. Let's hope the numbers match. It doesn't unfortunately work that way. So yeah, we had to be able to bridge the data gap between the two systems and also somehow make it work. The data flow was a completely different challenge because we did not have much of that before. It was there, but we relied on hopes and prayers that it would keep working, and if the virtual machine fell down, it all fell down like the tower of Jenga that it was. So we wanted something a little bit better for this, and the constraints were that the system was constantly in motion, particularly of the data itself, not as much the structure, but the data was pretty much the most important part. We also needed an alerting system because you gotta know when things go wrong, and ideally you do not want the business to be the one to come to let you know. You wanna know beforehand. It's like, oh, this one broke, let's fix it. But automation was pretty much critical to this process, at least we saw it as such. Because ideally you would want a flow that just keeps going and maybe like you touch it every few months. That's ideal. My favorite part, challenges with the business. So I talked earlier about legacy and the knowledge gap, and this was a particularly strong point that we had to deal with. Feedback was also not what I expected to spend most of my time into. Like this part right here was the monster that I did not expect to find. And we also had challenges making sure that we had data accuracy and how we would go about ensuring that. Legacy, everyone's favorite topic. As I talked about, the timing is pretty much essential because we only have like a few more months to finish the migration. So ideally, you want to have like an amount of time overlapping between the two systems so that you can compare the data, see if there's anything wrong at a glance or like deeper that you need to look into before the service shuts off and you have no choice. We also wanted to keep the spirit of the data because even though the whole system has changed behind the models that the business was using, we still wanted to keep like the same idea. We wanted to have like certain KPIs, certain ways of analyzing the data that we were accustomed to and they were standardized. But legacy is a hydra and you chop one head off and two more sprout in its wake. It was like playing a whack-a-mole with like deeply buried modeling issues. We also had no steward for this entire process, so we needed to establish that process again because that's always good to have. That one person you get to like point fingers at when things go wrong. I'm kidding, don't point fingers, please, don't quote me on that. So, feedback. This was honestly where I spent most of my effort with in terms of modeling because we had to both enable feedback and getting people to offer the feedback. It's not as easy as it seems. And finding a way to include the feedback productively. Like, was it something that we actually wanted to keep? Was it just one of those cases where it's like, we've just always done it like this. We don't know why, but we've always done it like this, so don't change it. So making the distinction between those two things was critical. And also, like, maybe the biggest challenge was coming to terms that we may all be looking at the data like a Rorschach test and everybody's seeing something different, which really did not help the case. Now, for data accuracy, the main question is, how do you compare the data between different systems? Like, you have a whole different way of making things work. So how do you do that switch? We wanted to make sure that we were supplying a data overlap, that people could look at the two systems in parallel in like one point of time that was like still active on the website. And also deciding on a strategy to migrate the source of truth, like when do you make the switch? Hopefully you're not forced to make the switch because the tool died. So we wanted a better solution than that. So what was the Adore Me solution to all of this? Well, first off, we started with the costs. No surprise there to anyone. But we wanted to use partitioning to reduce the processing time and, more importantly, the cost of our analytics. So what we came up with was making 4 different source tables for all of our platforms, and 1 aggregate source of data per platform, enabling all of the teams to do their reporting separately, as well as having them together for those teams that actually wanted to look at the whole picture. So these are refreshed every few hours. They are not as costly as their predecessors, which is like a big win for us. And we keep into account the changes between the systems, the data, and just like putting it all in a fine balance. For the modeling, we had to actually introduce a process of modeling for this specific data because it was different than the ones that we used to do before when we were dealing with more technical stuff. It's more easy to deal with technical stuff than like the business part of the equation. I know, it's my truth, but it is what it is. So we wanted to enable the automation of the process. Like ideally, nobody would be stuck somewhere just guarding a process and just like hammering it into place every single day for it to work. We wanted to have a system that would just like move and sway according to the changes and still end up with accurate data. We wanted to enable the business course over this entire subject as well because, well, they are our stakeholders, so we need to take into account their needs, what they wanted to see, and their respective input over certain areas of the model. But that had to be enabled, and not in the sense of like asking it of them, but making it easy for them. So we also had to enable better understanding because I did not know anything about session data, like nothing. I vaguely knew something about sessions and cookies and visit times, but that was it. So this whole migration enabled us to learn more about the data itself. And how did we do that? Yeah, good old Google Sheets. I don't know how much you can see from this, but it was a mess of columns. We just kept adding and changing statuses of things that we wanted to keep, things that we wanted to toss away. There were arguments about what we wanted to keep and what we wanted to toss away. Many, many arguments and many hours spent over this specific file. We had to, unfortunately, also fix the legacy, least pleasant process. So we didn't just want to fix the legacy, we wanted to prevent the mistakes of the legacy so we don't end up in the same place, trying to learn from our mistakes truly. And one way that we thought about doing that was first providing proper documentation, because it's something that we were missing before, and we wanted to make sure that we started off on the right foot with this one, and making sure that we had all of the data in before we started analyzing the situation. Then we were putting the data into context again. We were having user interviews going like, okay, I know this is how you've always done it before, but why are you looking at this data in a certain way? What are the scenarios? How are you looking at this? Don't just give me a link to a dashboard. show me exactly how you are using like the business motivation and what happens. Like what decisions are being driven from this specific data point, because at the end of the day, that's important. You don't just go to someone that's like, yeah, give me that medicine. That's not how you go to a doctor. It's like you go to them, you tell them the problem, they give you the medicine. And the difference mapping was something that, well, I did not have a lot of fun with, guys, because there was a mix of knowledge gap and people relying on legacy of several generations of employees, and nobody knew why we did a certain thing a certain way anymore, but they were arguing for it, so try to get them out of that, and it is the challenge. And we also wanted to establish ownership over the process, like clear ownership and knowing like who was responsible for every single bit and knowing how it all worked together. And how we went about doing that, you guessed it, Excel again. Well, sheets, but still, same principle. So this is probably, from the title, it's giving like final to modified vibes, because I can assure you that's exactly what it was. I spent more time in Google Sheets than I ever thought I would. But at the end of the day, we got everything that we needed. We made sure that everyone had clarity on what the data meant, how it was extracted, how it was calculated, and everybody was on a level playing field as far as information was concerned. So yeah, for the tech, we actually wanted to keep this simple. So I know that we're all about like complicated just tech and solutions, and we like to experiment a lot. But for this, we really had to take a step back and analyze what the tech requirements for this project were going to be. So first off, we wanted easy maintenance. This was not something that we as a team wanted to dedicate a lot of time to, so easy maintenance was something that was like on the topmost priority list. We wanted also to be easy to use, like nothing overly complicated, no significant shift in skill needed, and heavily documented, because that is our Bible. Yeah, I know. Documentation is great, guys. I know nobody likes writing it, but documentation is great, especially when it works. It is the best thing ever. We also wanted to have solid monitoring because, like I said, that's pretty much an essential part of a system that is constantly in motion. So how did we do that? Well, we started off with stored procedures, which is one of the solutions provided by Google BigQuery. And we automated this on both the source side, just calculating I wouldn't call them raw data sources anymore, but pretty much the raw data invested into these partition tables that would give us a significant reduction in cost as we were processing through them. And also like the business part of the process, just automating the final business models and calculating everything that went on behind the scenes. Inglorious code shot, because yeah, I had to include it. I had to show like a little bit of code. I don't know how much you can see on this screen really, but it's nothing overly complicated. It's just taking into account like a few variables and negotiating the imports and the exports accordingly. Then we had scheduled queries, which is like the baby version of the cloud scheduler, but it does its job. So why use a big tool when like a small tool does the same job for less? And we had, through this whole process, we only had like 2 scheduled queries, each of them calling on a stored procedure, and then it just like all flows from there. It's pretty nice. And trackable. You don't have to go anywhere to find it. It's just there. For the data quality, we also had nothing exceedingly complicated. Just from those 3 data quality checks stem 90% of the problems that we could foresee with the data, which is checking if they're up to date, checking if there are duplicates. That's it. That's like most of the support issues that we had to deal with were those 3 checks, and we were good. And throughout this process, we have not left Google BigQuery, which is a big plus because all of us in the data teams and most of our analysts, BigQuery is where we spend most of our time. Like, that's our bread and butter. We power up the MacBook in the morning. There's BigQuery there waiting for you. So it would make sense for all of our integrations to also be there as well. We didn't want to go back and forth between like compute engines and other processes. It's very easy, very convenient to maintain. If everything is in the same tool, in the same project, you can just find everything with the touch of a button. I'm really proud of that solution, by the way. For the business, well, what did we want for the business? We wanted fluid data access. We wanted documentation for them as well. And we wanted alerting. So all of these points were like really important to our analysts. First and foremost, we wanted to enable fluid acquisition of data because we have all of these people, they all have all of their different projects. How do you get the data to them in a way that neither part suffers? Like, you don't want your technical team suffering too much, you don't want your business team suffering too much. You want them to meet at a table and not hate each other. So we came up with the solution of our data marketplace and our own internal tool of data lands. So the data marketplace is a place where every single analyst can come in, they can browse the data, they can see all of the data that we have available for consumption. So I wouldn't exactly go about calling this a data lake, but rather a product of our data lake. So they can come here, they can browse the data, see what's available, and then they can easily take it to their own project for analysis, for dashboarding, for everything connected to that, using data lands. Next, we had the documentation. And I know that documentation tools and pages are nice, but when you're dealing with analysts and business people, if they want an answer to what this column is, and you make them change tools, you make them go someplace else for this information, you've lost them. Like, they're gonna take a guess, and the rest is history. So you don't want that to happen. So our solution for that was table-level documentation. Since most of our analysts are in here, they are in BigQuery, we wanted to have this information for them right there where they can see it. And my throat left me there for a full second. Next, we have the data quality and alerting, because it's not just important to know about the issues, but it's also important for other people to know about the issues, because it shows that you care, it shows them that there are processes in place, they can see this in a transparent manner, and they can go like, oh, I see a problem, but these guys got it, we're good, rest assured. Which is ultimately the goal of what we wanted to achieve. So we had our 3 main checks here, and as you can see, the result of this gets piped into a Slack channel. All of the business teams that use GA4 data are on the Slack channel, so they can see like real time when there's an issue, if we're handling, if we're not handling it, they can participate in the process. And just like that, like Indiana Jones, I slide through the moving door and end it on the Q&A note. So thank you for listening. I hope it was an informative talk.
Diana, thank you very much. So, as you know, the questions panel. Yes.
Yeah, hello. Nice presentation. I was wondering how are you treating the cookies era right now with the new GA4? Do you have something on the server side to track all the sessions or something?
Well, it was a whole effort from at least, I think, at least 2 different teams, and they're still working on the tracking side because, yeah, as it turns out, making that entire switch was a whole challenge technologically. So thankfully, not another side that I touched a lot on, but it was pretty difficult. From what I understand from the technical teams, they had to rebuild most of it. So it took a while between when they started working on it until I got to the data and I started working on it.
Yeah.
So that's a whole effort that we did not cover in this talk. I'm sorry, I should have probably made a note on that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do we maybe have another question for Diana? I actually wanted to ask you, where do you keep your documentation, but you answered, because we both agree on that part.
Yes.
It's a pain, but very useful.
So we have more than one source for documentation, but as I showed earlier, part of it is like where the users live, which is in BigQuery. We also have like separate guides and Confluence that take care of like longer paragraphs of data than we can fit inside of a description column.
Thank you very much, Diana, for this interactive presentation, and hope
Thank
to
you.
see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.